Welcome into press coverage. Dan Hope joined by Andy Anders here on a Saturday as Ohio State now has a second opening on its coaching staff for the 2025 season. Justin Frye leaving Ohio State after 3 years as the Buckeyes offensive line coach to take the same role with the NFL's Arizona Cardinals, interviewing for multiple NFL jobs this past week and ultimately deciding to head to Arizona, where he will reunite with one of his former Ohio State players, Paris Johnson Jr., who seems quite excited about the news of Justin Frye returning or not returning to the NFL, but reuniting with Paris Johnson in the NFL. And, frankly, Andy, I think 2 months ago, we probably wouldn't have guessed that this conversation about Justin Frye leaving Ohio State would have been him voluntarily leaving Ohio State for the NFL. Because, frankly, a couple months ago, a lot of Ohio State fans wanted Justin Frye fired. But that tone changed a lot during the college football playoff as Justin Frye led a unit that had lost Josh Simmons, had lost Seth McLaughlin, was really a makeshift offensive line, developed that unit into one that could lead Ohio State to a national championship. And the fact that he has now been hired as an NFL coach really validates something that you have talked about recently, that Justin Frye, for all the flack he may have gotten over the past 3 years for his recruiting, has proven that he is an excellent developer of offensive line talent. And that's why he's now got a job in the NFL.
Yeah, an NFL job makes a lot of sense when you consider the recruiting misses combined with the elite development that he's shown. And look, if he had stayed at Ohio State longer, he very well might have started getting some of those elite prospects now that, Josh Simmons and even Seth McLaughlin and Donovan Jackson, too, especially Donovan Jackson, are going to hear their names called in the NFL draft. And you would think Simmons and Jackson are candidates to hear their names in round one. But regardless now, I think this is – you get to focus on developing guys, which he's so clearly good at. There are few offensive line coaches, I think, in the country that could have taken what Ohio State's offensive line unit went through this year and produced, like you said, a national championship caliber front. And he developed them well. And in the NFL, you can just focus on that. You can just focus on the scheme and the X's and O's and the development of your players. You don't have to worry about talent acquisition. The front office handles that for you. Honestly, it makes a lot of sense when you just heard that Justin Frye was interviewing for NFL jobs. Yeah, okay, it might be a good change of pace for him because, as much as he had gotten in the good graces of Buckeye fans now, this is a high-pressure job, and he has certainly come under a lot of criticism in the last few years. It was the most highly criticized position. He was, outside of Ryan Day himself, I think Ohio State's most highly criticized coach. And now it's where do you go from here, of course. But I think this was a great job from, I guess, Justin Frye sort of gets to ride out on a high note, leading the offensive line the way he did in 2024.
Ohio State now with 2 vacancies to fill on its coaching staff. Ohio State still hasn't yet hired a new defensive coordinator to replace Jim Knowles, who left Ohio State last weekend to go to Penn State. But we'll stick with, focusing on the offensive line coach here on this show. And of course, the news just broke a few hours ago, so it's still very much just in the speculative phase of who could be Ohio State's next offensive line coach. But I think there's a few possible candidates out there that are intriguing to me. And I think the first name that jumps to mind for me is Kevin Wilson, who, of course, was Ohio State's offensive coordinator from 2017 to 2022, then became the head coach at Tulsa, was fired by Tulsa in November, has not yet found a new job, and is someone who, even the last couple years, has continued to maintain close ties to the Ohio State football program because of his son, Toby, who was a walk-on offensive lineman for the Buckeyes for the past 4 years. And so you're talking about someone who has a good relationship with Ryan Day, a good relationship with his staff, is very familiar with Ohio State, was Ohio State's tight ends coach in his previous tenure with the Buckeyes, but has a background in coaching offensive linemen, always worked very closely with the offensive line during his time at Ohio State. And you add in the potential factor that there's still the possibility Ohio State could also lose Chip Kelly to the NFL, which, no confirmed interviews yet, but those rumors have kind of continued to hover out there. I think calling Kevin Wilson and seeing if he's interested in this offensive line coach job, for me, that would be the first call on my list. But one, because I think he'd be a great offensive line coach and he'd bring great familiarity and offensive expertise to that role. And then two, if you do ultimately lose Chip Kelly, then you'd already have somebody in the pipeline who would be an obvious candidate to replace him as offensive coordinator.
Yeah, Kevin Wilson would be a great hire for the Buckeyes to get that ready-made offensive coordinator right there if Chip Kelly does go to the NFL, or at least an option. And Wilson's background developing offensive linemen, like you said, even when he was coaching tight ends at Ohio State, was always working closely with that position room and helping to develop those guys, when Greg Studrawa was here or whomever before him. Another intriguing option here I know will be on the mind of a lot of Ohio State fans is LeCharles Bentley. Talk about a former Remington winner at the center position for Ohio State. Now, of course, the thing that makes it kind of an intriguing option is he's not really been a college coach before, currently a senior advisor of player performance and development for the NFL. But still a guy, obviously, with that Buckeye background, knows a lot about offensive line play, and as kind of a younger motivator, he might connect well with recruiting, you would think. So kind of an intriguing option there, although not sure where his interests are in terms of being a college coach.
Yeah, he's got a lot of, varied business interests. He's got a sports agency. He trains NFL and college offensive linemen. So I'm not sure if he would want to make that move into being a full-time college coach. It's obviously a lot of different responsibilities that are on your plate in that role, but I certainly think if he was interested, he'd be a home run hire for the Buckeyes, and certainly someone who Ryan Day should call to at least gauge his interest. Or if he's not interested, he's somebody with so many connections in the offensive line coaching industry that he can probably give you some good recommendations of other people that you should go talk to. So definitely somebody that I think Ryan Day should call, have that conversation with one way or another. Some other names that I think come to mind. One option would be promoting Tim Drevno, who joined Ohio State as a quality control coach this past season. Before he joined Ohio State this past season, he was the offensive line coach at UCLA. He was previously the offensive line coach at USC, at Michigan with the NFL's San Francisco 49ers. And so he's somebody, if you wanted to prioritize that continuity, he has that background to be plenty qualified to be Ohio State's next offensive line coach. And certainly one of the reasons you bring in guys like that is to give you those kind of options to keep continuity. So I think he's somebody who will at least get a look here in this conversation. Of course, Ohio State could always go out and hire an offensive line coach from another top college program. It has the war chest to be able to do that. And, I think a few names that come to mind for me, Joe Rudolph from Notre Dame. He appears to at least be exploring his options, as he recently interviewed to be the Chicago Bears offensive line coach. He's had two offensive lines that were Joe Moore Award semifinalists in each of his first two seasons at Notre Dame. Very highly regarded within the industry. He was a graduate assistant at Ohio State from 2004 to 2006. I think, Ohio State fans could probably see, that offensive line in the national championship game did a better job of neutralizing Ohio State's defensive line than anyone else Ohio State faced in the CFP. So I think Joe Rudolph would definitely be a name that I would call. I think another name that comes to mind for me, if you wanted to get one back on Penn State after they poached Jim Knowles away, could be Phil Trotwine, their offensive line coach. He actually started his coaching career alongside Ryan Day as a graduate assistant at Boston College. He played for Urban Meyer at Florida, so he's got some ties that could potentially make that an intriguing match. Penn State's offensive lines have consistently gotten better over the course of his time in State College, so he's another name that comes to mind for me. Obviously, improved recruiting is going to be a big point of emphasis here. Whoever Ohio State brings in to be its offensive line coach they're going to want somebody who has a track record of landing some of those highly touted national recruits that Justin Frye did not land enough of during his 3 years as Ohio State's offensive line coach. So another name that comes to mind for me is Glenn Ellerbe from Tennessee, because, of course, he just led the recruitment to beat out Ohio State for 5-star offensive tackle David Sanders Jr. in the 2025 recruiting cycle. Now, he's taken some flacks for Tennessee fans for perceived lack of development there. So, I don't know, would he be an upgrade in the development area? I'm not sure. He's also somebody who's from Georgia, has spent most of his coaching career in the Southeast. So that one feels probably more unlikely to me than some of the other names, but he's still a name that jumps to mind for me just because of his track record as a recruiter and, obviously the fact that Tennessee was able to beat out Ohio State for David Sanders Jr. Mike Seleni is another guy who could potentially get involved in this. He was Ohio State's graduate assistant on the offensive line for the past 3 years, just became the offensive line coach at UNLV. It might be a little awkward that he just got another job to then come back to Ohio State. But if Ohio State really wanted him, UNLV would be hard-pressed to compete with that offer. He's somebody who drew a lot of praise from Ohio State's offensive linemen for the past 3 years for his role in helping develop them. So while, it would be taking a bet on someone who doesn't have a lot of experience as a full-time coach, I think he's someone who's viewed as a rising star in the offensive line coaching industry and would likely be a popular move among Ohio State's returning offensive linemen. And then, I think the one other option that's in the back of my mind too, and this would depend on whether Chip Kelly stays at Ohio State versus going to the NFL to become an offensive coordinator. But I also wonder if there's any possibility that perhaps Chip's role could change and he could move to focusing on working primarily with the offensive line, because, one thing that's been noticeable over the past week as Ohio State's been out on the road recruiting is Billy Fessler's been making a lot of those offers to quarterbacks. He's been out there filling Jim Knowles' spot on the recruiting trail as that 10th assistant coach. And it feels like Ohio State's priming Billy Fessler for an increased role in 2025 in one way or another, likely working with those quarterbacks. So I'm sure some of that has to do with the fact of preparing for the possibility of losing Chip Kelly. And if they were to lose Chip Kelly, perhaps they would promote Billy Fessler into that quarterback coach role. But I do wonder, Chip has a background pretty much working with almost every position on the offense. I do wonder, with his expertise in the run game, if it's possible they could shift Chip's role into working primarily with the offensive line and then promote Billy Fessler into that quarterback coach role.
Well, even in Will Howard's thank you video, he was shouting out Billy Fessler as someone who doesn't get enough praise in the program as a developer of quarterbacks. And I think that role is clearly there for him if Ohio State wants to do, even it might not even be offensive line. It might just be allow Chip to take a bigger step back and see bigger picture if he's still at Ohio State as offensive coordinator and letting Billy Fessler handle more of the quarterback development duties. It's clear that he has taken on a bigger, again, role in the program, doing some of those things with the quarterbacks, working with the quarterbacks. And it would, to your point, that's another option that's on the table for Ohio State. Although it is a big position room to juggle with offensive coordinator duties, I think that would be the drawback if you're considering something like that for the Buckeyes, because they're, not only is it a big room in terms of bodies, but it's also such an important position to get right. I mean, you can't really move the ball anywhere on offense if your offensive line isn't playing up to a certain standard. And even at least in one area of the game, there were times where Ohio State's offensive line this season might have been inconsistent in the ground game, but especially in the college football playoff, we're always holding up in pass protection, and they found ways to move the ball and coalesce the offensive line. And so interesting to see if that's how they go with how Chip would be able to juggle those responsibilities of development and still of scheming and play calling. But like you said earlier, it's all speculative at this point. This is fresh news, just happened this morning. So I'm interested to see who exactly Ohio State lands, because as it is at Ohio State, it could be someone we aren't even thinking about yet. It could be someone, you pick up the call, the brand has that draw to it. You pick up the phone and see who's out there. And obviously you go and try to get the best because it's Ohio State, and there aren't a whole lot of colleges out there that can throw $1 million on the table for an offensive line coach. So I'm sure that should attract some heavy interest, kind of in the same vein as we talked about as Ohio State was searching for a new defensive coordinator too. So, multiple holes on this coaching staff to fill for Ryan Day.
Well, we will be continuing to follow these two coaching searches that are now happening concurrently for Ohio State, as Ohio State looks for a new defensive coordinator and a new offensive line coach. So stay tuned with us over on 11warriors.com for any developments that might take place in those two coaching searches. And I'm sure we'll be back here with another video whenever Ohio State does hire a new offensive line coach and or a new defensive coordinator. So we'll look forward to talking to you again next time. Thanks for tuning in for another episode of Press Coverage.